This is the MS600 Lab number 1, exercise 3. Now in this exercise, we're going to show you the feature known as Active Directory is hosted by Microsoft. There are many tenants, so every business can get a tenant within this shared infrastructure. B2B describes the fact that we can have a bunch of users that belong to our Azure Active Directory. That these are our native user. Now, there are companies that we work with, our partner corporations, the company we're doing business with. They would have their users and their identity as well. Rather than having to bring their user into this directory and create an account for them in this directory, in our directory, what Azure AD B2B can do for us is to allow us to invite an identity external to our application, just like this. So here I'm going to invite a new user, and he'll be known as Victor Chen. Okay. Now using this information, we can invite anyone. This user can either have a Azure AD tenant identity already. Now, if this user that we're inviting isn't part of any Azure AD tenant, they will receive an email. So let's say abc@outlook.com. Now, if that email is not part of Azure AD tenant identity, they will be asked to create a Microsoft account using that email as their identifier. So in either case, either the recipient becomes a Microsoft account or the recipient's already a Microsoft Azure AD tenant identity. Either way it works. All right, so I'm not going to add this user to any particular roles and group. I'm just going to go ahead and invite them. And you should receive an email that you'll be invited into this tenant. And you'll notice that user principal name, okay, is an external user. The user type is a guest. And oops, I need to go back one page. Okay, you'll see the creation type is via invitation. Now you could also bulk invite users. Now to create an application that supports B2C is no different than the exercise we did in exercise 1, where we just simply create an app. Okay, because this is a function of the Azure AD, not necessarily a function of our app. Our app can just be a single tenant app. Okay, there's no difference here. So I'm going to add a new application registration. Now I'm going to still stay with a single tenant because I can invite users into this directory. Like our first exercise, we'll need application ID, we'll need a tenant ID as well. Okay, now I'm going to add a URL. Just like we did last time. All right, I'm going to add one more URI for the root of our application. Now I'm going to use the .NET tool to create a new application for single or guest. Now notice the template we're going to use is identical to our first lab. The authorization is simply single organization. There's no difference in what we're doing here. All right, so after copying and pasting these domain, tenant ID, client ID from the overview of the application, I think we're ready to give it a run. Oh wait, before we do that, we're going to make sure all the claim information shows up. So let's go to the views, home, index, should be pretty quick. All right, so we're going to print out all the claims, and we can see that who is authenticating that external user. All right, so I'm going to build and run it. All right, going back to the console build, down and run. Now, as a friendly reminder, before you build and run it, make sure you don't have any unsafe changes on these files. If you look at these, I made that mistake more than once. I suspect I'll make that mistake again as well. So this is the website. So if you got that unhandled exceptions, probably that you forgot to save the changes. Don't be me. All right, so here I'm going to sign in as the invited user. Now, of course, if I sign in from a user that's not invited, it will blow up. All right, so now it's the Azure AD is soliciting my permission because my identity authority, vchins.com, is about to share my information with this directory. Okay, so if I consent to this directory, the JWT will have an audience of this application. All right. So right now it's making the backend consent and redeem the JWT. All right. So don't need to stay signed in. All right. So here is a list of claims. Now, what is interesting is that I am being authenticated by my own identity authority, vchins.com, and the token, the JWT issued by my domain, is valid to be used by the application in this Azure PaaS tenant. Now, what you will notice is that the identity provider here, this GUID represents a tenant. Now, it actually represents my tenant here. That is a different tenant than my lab exercise, where this is the tenant where invited my account via vchins.com, while the one that's actually responsible for authenticating is my home tenant. So just to draw a quick diagram, let's say this is a big apartment building, right? So there's tenant A and there's tenant B. What we don't want to do is to create a user here. So this user's home tenant is tenant A. Now we don't want to duplicate the user's information to tenant B, because after all, this is the same infrastructure maintained by Microsoft. There's no reason for us to clone this user. Okay, because now the user, if we do this, the user now have to remember, oh, I belong to two different directories and I have two credentials and I have two username and passwords. Now there might be legitimate reasons why you may want that, but usually if I'm building an application that I want to invite my partners to use, I may not be interested in managing my partner company's identity. I may not be interested in knowing my partner company's hiring new employees or letting go employees. Now that wouldn't be my problem. I can just simply invite them. Okay. Now if a user needs to be disabled, tenant A will disable it. If there's user information needs to be updated, address, claims, etc., it will be the responsibility of tenant A. So the user obtained a JWT, and once that JWT is received, it's then forwarded to the application that builds on B, provided this user has been invited. All right. So this is exercise 3 for the MS600. And again, this is very much the same as a single tenant app. What we do want to establish is so that you know, in this huge Azure Active Directory infrastructure, all identities can be represented singularly once. Okay, we don't have to copy and recreate these identities all over the place. Now, this is the type of thing that can only operate at cloud scale, because if you come to think of it, there are millions of objects in this Azure Active Directory, And because we can all rely on this shared reliable infrastructure, we can now have single sign-on at global scale, rather than having to federate authentication to all sorts of external third-party systems, where essentially authenticating users, as long as they have an Azure AD presence, have an Azure AD account of some sort. All right, so this is Azure AD B2B, business to business, by inviting external users.